All right, so I do think we're ready to go now. And like I say, apologies for the slightly late start. Let me jump right in. And so obviously, 2 days ago, the Democratic Nominating Convention concluded, and this really concludes what has been a really profoundly tumultuous month in American politics, a month in which we've gone from having one leader to another leader, not via the normal procedure of, right, primaries selecting the leader of the Democratic Party, but via the leader who had been selected stepping aside and anointing a new leader, at least endorsing Kamala Harris, and then Harris very quickly securing the support of the people that matter in her party, but also popular support, a fair bit of energy behind her campaign, and then officially receiving the nomination and delivering perhaps the most important speech of her life, the most important speech of the campaign for her so far, her acceptance speech. And with the Democratic Nominating Convention having concluded, we can now contrast the two conventions, the two protagonists, the two speeches they gave, but more generally, the function that these two conventions played in the lives of the two main parties of the United States, and also the implicit visions, the politics, the theories of the election. And I want to in particular point to the vision of American democracy, society, and the future of our politics that was revealed. And I want to make the point that I think perhaps more so than at any point in American history, that I'm aware of in terms of my own lifetime. Obviously, in the 1850s, we had vastly conflicting conceptions of American democracy as either being a democracy in which it was legitimate and permissible to enslave an entire population, or a society in which democracy required the abolition of slavery. In the early 20th century, we faced a similar question about the enfranchisement, the suffrage of women, and to be as clear as possible, that really didn't split the parties in the way that the question of abolition did 75 years earlier. And then in the aftermath of the Great Depression, we faced similar questions about the role and size and power of the federal government in regulating our economy and in guiding us out of a Great Depression. So there are moments in our history where the two parties seem to have fundamentally conflicting conceptions of American society and the role of democracy in guiding our society into that future, or in maintaining continuity with the current form. And that this these two conventions make clear in a way that I think was reasonably clear already, but hasn't been displayed with such sharp contrast before. And I think, frankly, these two candidates, as opposed to these two candidates, make clear also that we are in the middle of the contest of a contest for the future of American society and democracy, a contest that includes what kind of democracy we will have, if we will have a pluralist liberal or a populist illiberal democracy in the United States, whether or not we will embrace the transition into post-traditionalism and use the state to actively protect the full range of lives and loves that people in a post-traditional society want to embrace, or as opposed to that, whether we will use state power to enforce a narrower range of identities and ideals of values and ways of lives as being those that receive official state sanction and support, whereas others are stigmatized and discouraged. And finally, a contest about how the state addresses the growing vulnerability and precariousness of large portions of our population? Is it primarily through policies that aim to repair and restore the functioning of the American economy via creating more affordable and realistic paths to economic security, to education, to opportunity? Or is it instead a path that essentially says the forces that are undermining opportunity, fairness, equality, decency, sustainability, prosperity in the United States are external to us, and we need to build a fortress, walls on our borders, protect ourselves from foreign goods? These are I think, the central contrasts that have emerged. And I think, it's not just that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are very different kinds of people. One's a man, one's a woman, one's white, one's a person of color. That much is obvious. But also, right, one is an entrepreneur, a businessman, a billionaire. The other is a lawyer and a lifelong politician. One is, right, a person who has aligned himself with the forces of grievance and resentment. The other has a much more hopeful sense of the future of the United States. Um, all of that is clear in their persona, but I think what is increasingly clear is the way that they represent conflicting, competing views of America's future. Now, last week when we were together in person, I started to talk with you about economic policy, and in particular, Harris's economic policy from a critical vantage. If there's time, I will continue a little bit of that today as well. But the central focus will be on the contrast between the two conventions. And so let me start that contrast, and let me actually, before I do that, notice one thing important just in the visuals, just in the imagery here, right? And Donald Trump dressed more or less as everyone expected he would at the convention. I think the one exception that this uh, image does not display is that he had a bandage on his ear, right? Because he had survived an assassination attempt just days before. And I do think one of the striking things about his address is that the new material in his acceptance speech was almost exclusively about having survived the assassination attempt. But going back to the imagery, right? The business suit, the red tie. This is Donald Trump, the businessman, the entrepreneur, the success, the person who fires people, the person who is usually or almost always the dominant person in the room. That's the Brioni suit, etc. Right? Um, as you may be aware, right, when Hillary Clinton gave her acceptance speech 8 years earlier, she wore white, and there was a lot of people, a lot of women in the room in particular who were dressed in white. There was a lot of attention on social media. There were actual memos going out from different women's rights groups encouraging women to wear white. White in this context is the color of the suffragettes. It's the color of protest against the exclusion of women from the power structure of the United States. And please note that Harris did not wear white. I'm not sure if that's black or dark blue, but what I want to call this is the prosecutor's uniform, right? And to make it clear, right, this was not a celebratory speech. This was not saying, we have finally arrived, women. This was a prosecutor's speech. This was a serious speech. This was a speech that began with, we've got business, right? The first lines out of her mouth as she quieted the crowd, and that continued, right, for only 38 minutes. I think one of the shortest acceptance speeches in modern history, that was disciplined, that was carefully structured, that was clearly organized in order to appeal to precisely the voters Harris needs to win in order to win this race. And so I think the uniform expresses, on the one hand, the discipline, the seriousness, and the fact, on the one hand, that this is a contest, that this is a race, that this is not yet won by either side, and that what happens in the next 2 months will determine who is the next president of the United States, but also what the future of the United States will be. And in this respect, I want to suggest that having these two conventions behind us, having the home stretch of the election in front of us, it is clearer to me than it has been at any point in the last decade that this is the most consequential election we will probably face in the first half of the 21st century. I can't, with a crystal ball, see all the way to 2050, but I do see the writing on the wall here that the person who wins this election will have the capacity to put their stamp on the future of the United States. And the differences between the visions animating the candidacies of the two main parties couldn't be more far apart. So now, with that in mind, let me get into some of the details. And some of this is not going to be about the visions at first. It's going to be more about the strategy. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? The first thing I think to notice about the Republican nominating convention. I'm certainly not alone in remarking this. I think it was very obvious to the people in attendance and to the people watching, is that it felt really like a victory celebration. It felt as if, and I think this was the spirit in the room, and in a sense, the received wisdom of the moment, that the Republicans had basically won this election. That as a result of the dismal performance of Joe Biden in the June debate, it was clear that momentum was with Donald Trump. And I learned this recently. The internal polling of the Democratic Party suggested on the eve of the Republican nominating convention that Biden had a 7% chance of winning the election. Right. And again, I don't think there's any moment in uh, recent political history where a representative, the leader, the incumbent of a major party has been that far behind as we enter the critical stretch of an election. And having said that, I can only assume that the Republican Party's polling was showing exactly the same thing, and hence the confidence that infused the gathering in Milwaukee. But having said that, I would note also that it was a little peculiar and perhaps quite a bit revealing that the Republican Party and Donald Trump in particular, his campaign team, did not anticipate that Joe Biden would drop out. And I want to suggest that had they anticipated that Biden would drop out, had they anticipated in particular that the Democrats would find a more capable, a more viable candidate, that they should not have run a convention as if it were the election night victory celebration. And something similar goes to choosing JD Vance. And so I do think that in many respects, the Republicans lost a strategic opportunity. And let me speak in detail for a moment about what that opportunity is, what the function is that conventions can play in the 21st century. And so we know conventions don't choose candidates, right? By the time you get to the convention, the candidate has already been chosen. This was abundantly clear with the Democratic nominating convention because although they went through the roll call, that was merely a performance, right? Actually, the delegates had voted online 2 weeks before the convention occurred, right? And there hasn't been a convention in 50 plus years. You have to go back to 1968, where it hasn't been clear by the time you get to the convention who the nominee is. And so having said that, what is the function of the convention? And one function of the convention, of course, is free airtime to reach the voters in an environment that you have complete control over, but that doesn't simply feel like a scripted advertisement. This is not a 30-second slot that you've paid to put on in between the content that people are actually watching TV for. This is something that people tune into to see how the party is defining and presenting itself. And so one of the things parties give the candidate, and I should say the conventions give the party and the candidate the opportunity to do, is to present themselves as they want to be seen by the electorate they are trying to reach. And it doesn't seem to me that the Republican Party did much to reach out to anybody who might be an undecided voter, right? And I'll say more about this in a moment, but I think that in many ways, to the extent that there was a theory of how the convention contributed to the campaign, it was presenting the coronation of Donald Trump as if it were fait accompli, as if it had already occurred, as if the election were a mere formality, the outcome of which was obvious, in the hopes that that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it would generate defeatism on the other side more than it generated or displayed complacency on the Republican side. And if you believe that Joe Biden will be your opponent all the way through November, perhaps that makes sense because in many ways, Joe Biden appears to be defeated already by age, by the wear and tear of four mainly crisis years as president. And so maybe there was a kind of strategy behind this. I think in light of the fact that Biden is no longer the candidate that Harris is, it's a strategy that wasn't well calibrated. It is not a traditional convention strategy, whereas the Democrats were much more conventional. We have this opportunity to reach out to the undecided voters to display the diversity of our party, the inclusiveness of our party, the energy of our party, the ideas of our party in the most attractive light to a whole bunch of different constituencies, but most importantly, let's call them the Obama, Trump, Biden voters, the people who actually change their minds on the basis of who the candidate is and what they see in events like this. And I think it's quite obvious that the Democratic Party had thought through, right? What do these people need to hear from us in order to be convinced that 2024 is a Harris year and not a Trump year. And so they reached out to the middle, and I think they did it quite effectively. So that's the, I think, first big contrast. Again, a contrast in strategy. I think this is very clearly represented in the difference between choosing J.D. Vance and choosing Tim Walz as the vice presidential nominees. Next big contrast, and this has to do with the way in which the convention functions in a second regard, and that is for the party to define itself for itself, right? And so everyone who is in a leadership position in this party, including state and local leaders, including organizers in the union movement or church movements or civil rights movements, have one opportunity every 4 years to be in the same place. And a lot of this doesn't occur on the television screen, right? There are breakfasts and lunches and cocktails and roundtable discussions and receptions that are doing the work of, in essence, trying to fashion the identity of the party, but also having a contest about the future of the party. Where is this party going? Which policy agenda, which future leaders present the best hope for future success? And I want to suggest that the Republicans, again, as far as I can tell, did not do a lot of this and certainly did not display a lot of this to the American people. And the reason they didn't, it seems to me, and what I think the Milwaukee Convention really revealed is that this has become a party of a single individual and their ideas, his ideas, right? And that individual, of course, is Trump. And what he demands is loyalty to him as a person, subservience. If there was a message that was conveyed about the party, it is that the Republican Party has become the vehicle for a single powerful, dominant leader, right? And I don't want to equate this with fascism, but I do think structurally the way in which the leadership principle was used by Mussolini and Hitler, who Trump himself has studied, is extremely important. That what people want in insecure, tumultuous, seemingly disorderly or anarchic times is someone to impose order. And that person needs to have both the capacity and the instrument to use their will decisively to counteract the forces that are disorganizing society, causing disarray. And that means, right, that requires personal strength and leadership. And so what was on display in the Milwaukee Republican Nominating Convention was Trump's dominance. Whereas I think the Democrats were very open about conducting a contest for the future of their party. They had Biden speak, but they had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and both of the Obamas and both of the Clintons, right? All speaking. And I think if you paid attention, presenting at least somewhat different visions of where they thought the party should go, right? Clinton's triangulating pragmatism as opposed to Sanders' aggressive left progressivism, populism, are not the same vision of where the party should go. And so one of the ways to think about this is that there was an absence of party elders in Milwaukee, right? You did not see a Bush. You did not see a Cheney. You did not see even Mike Pence or Paul Ryan. And I think if you were to draw a line in terms of where the cutoff is, it's not 2016, 2017. It's not when Trump takes over the Republican Party. It's actually later than that. It is January 6th, 2021, right? If you were critical, right, of the invasion of the Capitol and the effort to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, not through legal channels, not through the courts, but through a violent insurrection, you were not welcome. If you so much as described in accurate terms what happened on January 6th, you were not welcome because part of the dominance of Trump is in asserting that the election of 2020 was stolen and that what happened on January 6th was either perfectly legal and patriotic or a mirage actually conducted by the left and the Antifada forces, or else not his fault, right? And so part of his dominance is in his capacity to define reality. Anybody who objects to that reality, which is practically anybody who had a leadership position in the Republican Party prior to the 2020 election, is absented from Milwaukee. Whereas, right, the Democratic Party made clear that it embraces its past and is open, is internally pluralistic, that the Clintons and the Obamas and Pete Buttigieg and Raphael Warnock and Megan Whitmer and Tim Walz and Kamala Harris can all belong to the same party, even though they have important differences generationally, but also in terms of policy. And that leads me then to the second related contrast, which is that the Republican Party, precisely because it has become the party of a single individual, the instrument of his use of will to impose his power on the dangerous social circumstances of the 21st century, doesn't have a deep stable of alternative leaders within it. In Milwaukee, what we saw was Trump anoint Vance as his successor, right? And so we know who the vice president is. We know who presumably Trump wants to take over the reins of the MAGA movement once he is no longer able to lead it. But we don't see a wide variety of alternative Republicans. Yes, there are a few people, but really, it's Hulk Hogan or the leader of the Ultimate Fighting Club or Kid Rock. These people are not going to be the future leaders of the Republican Party, right? The rumors notwithstanding, there was not a moment on the stage for Beyonce or for Taylor Swift on the final night or any night of the convention, right? This was focused on primarily the future leaders of the party. And we have Walz, and we have Warnock, and we have Whitmer, we have Wes Moore. I could keep going, AOC, right? But again, I think two things stand out. The first is that there are a lot of them, right? And they seem to, I didn't even mention Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro, right? That there are a lot of Gavin Newsom, viable new leaders to this party. And by the way, they also have different visions of where the party should head. And in many ways, I think they were trying to persuade Harris which of the visions is the right visions. And not only does that indicate a party that is not just the vehicle of an individual, but that contains multiple competing rivals within the party, a team of rivals, to use the famous language that was used to describe Lincoln's cabinet. But also, it indicates that this is a party that does not demand subservience or uniformity. It embodies the pluralism that is its vision of the future of America. I should have mentioned, of course, Pete Buttigieg, who I'll come back to, I think is another extremely important voice and exemplar within the party. So now moving a little bit more to the strategy, right? And I do think that we got two different theories of how to win this election on display through the contrast between these conventions. Trump has a theory, and I want to be as careful as possible to emphasize that Trump's theory in 2024 is pretty much his theory in 2016 and 2020. And in 2016, it was enough to win a narrow electoral college victory. In 2020, despite a pandemic and the social and economic dislocation it was causing, it was enough to get Trump within roughly 100,000 votes of another victory. So I don't think we should dismiss this theory of how to win an election in American politics, even if we don't like it and we don't respect it. It has proven success. And I think it's got roughly right now a 50% chance of winning the current election. So, what is that theory? That one needs to display strength, vigor, dominance, success, and indomitability for not the whole electorate, right? And please note, probably the majority of the electorate considers someone who essentially beats their chest, who tries to do a dominance display as their primary form of political appeal. The majority of the electorate finds that at best off-putting or repellent. But having said that, I think that a substantial portion of the electorate, those who find politics, society, and the world as increasingly hostile to them, who view themselves as locked in an existential struggle in many respects, as disrespected and disregarded by the call it the cosmopolitan tribe, call it the liberal elite, call it all those who support them and who want to take the benefits, the wealth, the rights, the opportunities that this society creates and hoard them for themselves, distribute them only among themselves. But that group who is struggling for their relative position in this society wants this kind of leader. And I want to point out, right, that this theory of the election is really also Trump's theory in a sense of running his business. He has a brand. The brand is him. It's his name. It's his persona. It's his glitz. It's originally his Playboy form of nouveau riche luxury, right? And it converts into a kind of entrepreneurial model of success that he displays in his reality TV show. And then from there, a performance of strength and dominance for the people who feel left out, disregarded, and threatened by the future direction of our society. And what that means, frankly, is that this brand matters more than policy. And I see you've got your hand up. I'll pause on that point. Go ahead.
Yeah, it just really bothers me of these people who that the Republicans are talking about that feel this way, and I just wonder how many of them have been told that they feel this way,
So
rather than it really came out of the people rather than pushed down onto them.
let me offer you my way of thinking about this, and there are other ways of thinking about this. Um, you're suggesting an essentially top-down model of opinion formation or of coalescing around a candidate, right? That the candidate tells the people how to feel. And I have a more dynamic and two directional theory about this. The candidate can only succeed in um, suggesting to the people how they should interpret their experience if the interpretation the candidate offers articulates something that is already plausible and already felt by the people who support him. And so there's a term goes back to Raymond Aron, a French sociologist, a feeling structure, right? And the feeling structure is not yet a political program. It's actually often a very inchoate idea that, on the one hand, can be articulated in several different ways, and on the other hand, gives them a sense of what is plausible and what is not, right? And I think the feeling structure of a large number of Americans is that this society is leaving them behind, that they are not valued or included or respected, that there is a fundamental economic insecurity that they experience on a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis, that being in an economically insecure place gives rise to anxiety, and anxiety is a difficult emotion to bear. That in addition to that, these are people who, until quite recently, felt that they were the backbone of American society, that they were valued for their contribution, for their work ethic, for the wealth that their work produced, which was the wealth of our nation. And so they've gone from feeling secure and respected to feeling insecure, ancient, anxious, and disrespected, right? That's their feeling structure, right? And that's a terrible place to be. And I think we should have empathy for that. And then the question is, how is it articulated? And I want to be as clear as possible, as careful as possible. I don't have social scientific evidence for this, although some of it is out there. Most of it is more anthropological or interpretive. There's a new book coming out by Arlie Russell Hochschild at UC Berkeley, now emeritus. I'm in contact with her. I'm having her come to a conference at Sarah Lawrence, or at least Zoom into a conference at Sarah Lawrence. And she did this really wonderful work on rural Louisiana. She's doing another installment of this, and she goes and she lives with the people who baffle her, right? So she's from Berkeley, she's a liberal. She wants to figure out how in the world the people from southern Louisiana, who have been so damaged by the petroleum industry, by the big chemical companies, by the Republican Party and their policies, nevertheless vote Republican on such a consistent basis. And so her effort is to explain how the feeling structure of these people is susceptible to this articulation, and how the Democratic Party's failure to provide an alternative, plausible, articulation has left a vacuum that someone
Yeah.
like Donald Trump can occupy. So, yes, Donald Trump is directing their anxiety into anger. That's what I call the alchemy of populism. I think it's an incredibly important transformation because to feel anxiety, to feel disrespected, to feel insecure, to feel that the future is one of decline is a terrible place to be psychologically. To turn that into anger is the first step in seeking a remedy, right? But what Trump then does is direct that anger at outsiders, right? At immigrants, especially, but also at the Chinese for having stolen your jobs, and at the liberal elite for having engineered this all because it benefits them, right? And that at least gives you someone to blame and some idea that something might be done. And until the Democratic Party has an alternative way of articulating that feeling structure, Trump remains a potent force in our politics. So does that help, Ann, to
Yeah.
think through, right? I don't think that it's that people were longing for exactly what Trump gave them, but I think they were longing for something that articulated their sense that this society is moving in the wrong direction and it's particularly bad for people like me and it's unfair and I should be angry about it and there should be somebody standing up for me. That's the group that Donald Trump has captured. And it's part of the reason he has so much loyalty is because I think there was a widespread perception that neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party had succeeded in connecting, in getting, in articulating, and ultimately in serving the interests and the needs of that large portion of our population. So,
Thank you.
with thank you for the great question, Anna. Obviously, it was productive to drill down on that. Let me go back to then where we were. And the idea that this vision, right, of a powerful leader identifying your enemies and working to protect you against them is what was really, I think, the connecting thread of the Republican nominating convention and, sorry for the metaphor, the secret sauce of Donald Trump's success. I think Harris's theory of the election is quite different, right? And it's much more conventional, much more traditional, but I do think it also represents a way in which the Democratic Party is learning from Donald Trump, is learning from the populism that Donald Trump represents, and is integrating elements of that populism into its own approach to politics. And so I will start out, whether you're talking about, right, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, or Bill Clinton, right? We could throw Al Gore into the mix if we want to, right? The leaders of the Democratic Party for a very long time have been rather wonkish in their focus on policy details and have used events like a nominating convention to indicate that they have specific policy proposals that they believe will address the problems that they find prevalent in American society and that they believe the voters want them to address. And I think if you watch Harris's speech again and look for policy detail, you will be struck by how little there was. Part of the reason she was able to give a speech in less than 40 minutes, applause lines and interruptions notwithstanding, was precisely because this was a speech that was all but shorn of policy detail. And that her theory of the election is that what she can do is focus on a few potent issues that do not require policy details. Clearly, right? And again, I think that basically 1/6 of Harris's speech was dedicated to abortion and procreative freedom, control of one's own body, and that the policy here is simple: federal legislation protecting a national right to abortion. I will say very quickly, even if Harris wins the election, even if the Democrats retain control of the Senate and regain control of the House, there is only one viable scenario in which she accomplishes what her central policy pledge is. And that is if the Democrats suspend or revoke the filibuster in the Senate. And so I anticipate that if in fact there is a Harris victory and Democratic control over Congress, that will, in a sense, be the first big debate. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. So let's just note, right? On the one hand, access to abortion, noting that Donald Trump appointed to the Supreme Court the justices who have now removed this as a secure right for at least 50% of the childbearing age women in the United States and has bragged about it, right? And please note, Trump is in the middle of trying to further moderate his stance. He recognizes the vulnerability. Harris, again, is going to have to be prosecutorial in saying, no, you don't get to do this and then deny that you did this. This is what you did. This is what you will continue to do. This is what we need to undo. And please note that in many respects, this is a conservative idea in the classical 19th century sense of that term, i.e., it's going back to what we had already. It's maintaining a status quo that we were happy with. And again, 77% of Americans favor a federal right to protect abortion. 43% of Republicans favor that right. This is an obvious winning issue for Harris, and it has the advantage of being a populist issue in the sense, and let me specify, the presidency is weak in the United States in the 21st century. I don't want to suggest that it doesn't mean that it's not dangerous if it's in the wrong hands, right? It can be dangerous. But in terms of its capacity to make policy, to pass law, the person who inhabits the Oval Office is hamstrung by the fact that we are deeply polarized, evenly split, that we keep shifting back and forth between control of Congress, but neither party really gets a workable legislative majority, especially with the filibuster in place, but with the general impediments to legislating built into both the Constitution, which gives us a bicameral legislature, and into the structure of the institutions, their committee systems, their rules, their procedures. All of this means that the president may promise bold initiatives, but delivering on those promises is very difficult in the 21st century. And I think one of the advantages of what I'm calling progressive populism, just a few bold ideas, not a lot of uh, details in terms of the policy, is it doesn't involve over promising. This is something the federal government can do by passing one single, relatively simple piece of legislation. Her second main promise, affordability, right? And price gouging on groceries is one example of this. I think the much more promising and important aspect of her agenda, what we started talking about last week, is affordability in housing, especially of a kind that allows people to get to the 5 or 6 cities in the United States or their metropolitan areas where job creation remains robust and that allows people to get on the property ladder, that allows them not just to rent, but actually to purchase. If she can do that, I think she will have done a great deal toward restoring middle class upward mobility in the United States. We've looked at this together. If you get an increase in income for your group, that can be highly unstable and very difficult to translate into permanent increases in wealth. But if you get the kind of wealth that owning a home represents, not only do you tend to conserve or maintain the status and security that that affords you, but you're also very likely to pass that down to your children. So I think that's an important and again vague and very potentially potent policy issue. Third policy issue is, of course, immigration, right? And she just tried to, and we'll have to see, steal the thunder of the Trump campaign and the Republican Party, dodge the accountability for a very unpopular aspect of Biden's presidency, and say, there's legislation that would address this, that has the support of Republicans and Democrats and independents in the Senate. And the only reason it's not law is because Donald Trump torpedoed it in order to get elected. And that is another example of him putting his welfare, well being advantage over that of the country, right? So, having said all of that, this helps us to see what I think her other theory of the election is, which is that Trump needs to be shrunk. He needs to be diminished. He needs to be belittled. He needs to be described as a small, selfish, silly, unserious, as she put it, man who precisely because he lacks in generosity, because he lacks in compassion, because he lacks in focus and seriousness, in the willingness to do the work, to not just aggrandize himself, but to actually take seriously the issues and difficulties that others face would be dangerous and more dangerous if he were re-elected to the presidency, right? So note, right, that this strategy, I think, is coupled, right? That part of the reason the Democratic Party is putting up with a candidate being so vague about policy and is not dividing between a progressive wing and a moderate wing in the way that it has done in the past and fighting it out is because of the unifying focus on preventing a second Trump term. And here I think Harris very effectively in her speech, which I'm about to turn to, suggested that the real danger of a second Trump term is not just Project 2025. It's not just the abuse of the powers vested in the presidency by the Constitution and the way in which the Supreme Court seems to have removed the guardrails of legal accountability for abusing those powers. It's also in the way in which Project 2025 and Donald Trump himself have indicated that they will try to undo the progress of the last 25 years. And that progress has been limited. That progress needs to be extended. That progress is not felt by a lot of people. But the idea that we have had an African American president, now two women as the major party candidates, that gay marriage is now the law of the land, that our society has seen much greater tolerance for women, for immigrants, for gays, for diversity, for nonconformist religious and irreligious belief, that this is valuable and that we increasingly use the power of the state to protect the weak and the vulnerable. This too is valuable, and that Donald Trump will undo all of that if given a second term, or at least do his best to, is allowing Harris's strategy to be as much negative as positive. It's not as negative as Joe Biden's. It's not simply he's a threat to democracy and democracy is on the ballot, because that aggrandizes Trump. That makes him a larger than life figure who takes all of our attention. This is a tricky circle to square, but Harris is trying to do it. And I think the phrase that captures this best is he's an unserious man who would be a serious threat if he were the president again. I would just note very quickly that the Democrats were really making a play for owning some values that have been very much associated with the Republican Party for a long time. Freedom. I don't know if you've seen, there are word charts being developed of how many times the terms were used by major speakers at each of the conferences. Freedom is much more used by Democrats in 2024 than it is by Republicans. And of course, they're trying to change the meaning of the concept of freedom at the same time that they claim it for their candidate and their party. Freedom is now not free enterprise, freedom of contract, individuality, freedom to succeed, so much as it is freedom, as they repeatedly said, to love and live how you want, right? And the sense that the Republican Party threatens that kind of freedom, the freedom of expressive individuality, which has become so central to the post traditional culture of the United States, at least as far as large portions of Americans are concerned. And then the idea that it is normal to be in an interracial family. It is normal to be in a blended family, that it is normal to be in a homosexual marriage and to have children in that marriage, that what is weird, what is retrograde, what is authoritarian and menacing is the effort in the 21st century to suggest that there's only one right way to organize our society, our families, our love, our lives. And that, I think, again, begins to get at how important this struggle is. The idea that the Democrats are also trying to claim progress and optimism for their side, that there is actually progress being made. We haven't got as far as we need to get. We need to do more to make opportunity available to all Americans, but that we can do this. Again, I think when you contrast, right, Walter Mondale and Ronald Reagan in this regard, the scripts have completely flipped in terms of which party is now the party of fear and which is the party of hope and optimism. And the Republicans have made it clear by what they presented from the stage, what they think matters to their constituents as well. Jobs, immigration, inflation, right? And those are all of a kind. People have been getting worse off for 40 years, and they continued to get worse off under Joe Biden. And those are the reasons that's what the president needs to concentrate on, but also strength and order, that our society hasn't just become more insecure economically, it's become more disorderly, more anarchical. I don't think that's accurate. That comes back to Anne's question. You know, how much can you distort somebody's sense of reality to fit your political program? Well, I hate to say it, but probably an awful lot, especially in a world in which it's not just the president or the presidential candidate saying this, but in which Fox News parrots it, in which social media very much amplifies and feeds a distorted conception of how much crime or how much anarchy or how many illegal immigrants there are. Um, Final thing I want to focus on here for just a minute. As I say, Harris's speech was short, organized, careful, and deliberately constructed to appeal to the voters she needs to win this election. What did she do in the speech? And I want to suggest that if you look at the speech, it divides very evenly into three main arguments. The first is a biography, right? But it's not just this is who I am. It is this is how I became the person who has the values that I have. In that sense, I want to suggest it's a moral or an ethical biography. And please note that the central person in this biography is Kamala Harris's mother, and her mother is a woman, an immigrant, a woman of color, right? And the emphasis was in particular on work ethic, on can-doism, right? You know, don't complain, do what you need to do to change it. On mobility, right? She started out in the flats renting a house and eventually became more economically secure. On optimism, on justice. And so I want to just notice for a moment, this is an implicit argument. Harris is not saying out loud and directly, we should be more welcoming of immigrants because immigrants carry American values into the 21st century, right? This is a different argument than the argument I've made for you, which is the United States should welcome immigrants because we need them economically. Harris is making a much more direct, if not quite frontal assault on the so-called new conservatism, which argues that immigrants threaten the cohesiveness, the national identity of our society. And she's saying, I became who I am, right? Which is a prosecutor and a leader of American society because of the example that my mother, an immigrant, set for me. And by the way, please note, right, that both Donald Trump, who's married to an immigrant, and J.D. Vance, who's married to the daughter of immigrants, could tell uplifting stories about immigration, but they don't. And frankly, they can't because they are scapegoating immigrants. They are pointing to immigrants and saying, they're the reason you don't have jobs. And I think this is actually incredibly important as a way of beginning to counter that argument, which probably cannot be countered directly without undermining her viability as a candidate, but doing it indirectly through her biography. The second big component of her speech was a prosecutor's opening statement. And I don't think this is the end of it, but I think this was the most concise and forceful presentation of the indictment of Donald Trump as small minded, self serving, and dangerous only when empowered by us. If we give this small minded man the power of the presidency, be careful. And the idea that he doesn't respect the rule of law, that he doesn't respect the peaceful transfer of power, that he's only after himself, and that if you give him the leadership of this country, he will use that power in a self-serving way, I think is implicitly, again, a really strong argument against the theory of leadership that Donald Trump has. And here, looking at Harris's earlier biography, the one she wrote in 2020, you get a fuller sense of this idea that she experienced her mother being disrespected. She experienced her best friend being sexually harassed. She experienced economic insecurity. And all of this led her to a vision of state power, right? That is very different from Donald Trump's vision as an instrument of justice and dignity for the weak against, I'm sorry, I made a mistake here, against the powerful, against the predatory, against the abusive. And that is a fundamentally different conception of leadership than Trump is offering. Again, I want to suggest this is why this contest matters so much to the future of democracy. And then her policy agenda focused on abortion, affordability, immigration, tolerance. It's very vague. It's very broad. It's, in a sense, a kind of progressive populism of the left to counter the populism of Donald Trump. And I just want to emphasize tolerance for a moment and the way in which this ties together the elements of her speech. I thought Pete Buttigieg was very effective, and particularly effective when he spoke non-politically as a storyteller about his own family, about dinner time, if you remember, and how chaotic it is trying to get dinner on the table for his twin 3-year-olds, and that this was a moment for him to reflect on the fact that when he grew up as a gay boy and young man in Indiana, it never occurred to him that he could be openly married in a same sex marriage, let alone that he could have children. And that when the power of the state is used to protect the weak against the powerful, when it's used to include immigrants who subscribe to American values, when it's used to do things like promote the availability of abortion to women, which is essential to their political, economic, and social equality in the United States, you get a very different kind of state, a very different kind of democracy. Let me conclude very quickly. I'm talking about progressive populism. And what I think differentiates progressive populism from right wing populism is first and foremost the idea that we are a pluralistic society and that we need to make room for different ways of being American, that the enemies that we have as a people are not outsiders or foreigners or the abnormal or nonconformist. If we have enemies, it is the socially powerful who want to prey upon our weakness. And that in the 21st century, what that means is corporations and the hyper wealthy and their ability to deprive us of decency, opportunity, affordability, economic viability, and that that's an alternative way of articulating what I've called the feeling structure that is, I think, much less destructive and much more potentially constructive in actually presenting solutions. And so while I want to be as clear as possible, I didn't go into the polling today, but the polling, depending on which model you look at, is certainly favorable to Harris. I think, right, the fact that on each night of these conventions, 2 or 4 million more people watch the Democrats than watch the Republicans indicate among other things, as Obama put it, that Trump is stale, right? That his line is not fresh anymore. And I do think one more thing that Harris and the Democrats are trying to do was to reclaim the mantle of change and reform and, if you will, insurgency. That she is not the incumbent vice president. She is, by dint of who she is, but also what kinds of policies she would offer, a different kind of politician. And Trump, we've already tried, and it didn't get us very far. Why don't I stop there? Barbara, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Got your hand up?
Oh, that's
It's
Dave.
actually David.
Oh, that's Dave.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you say. I would add two other things. It seems to me that one of the things that the Democratic convention and and all the speakers did is they normalized diversity in a way that says that we're just who we are and we're patriots just like everyone else, and you can't take that away from us. You know, and there's and I think that goes a long way to inviting other people under the umbrella.
Yeah, thank you. And
Yeah, thank you.
And diversity. I'm just going to mute you, David, because we're getting a strong echo. The normalized diversity by presenting it as non-threatening, right? I mean, I think that's really important to notice, right? Here's a child of immigrants who became an attorney general, who got a settlement for the homeowners of California that turned 4 billion into 20 billion people. Thank goodness that her mother raised her the way she did. Please note, she didn't even mention that in her speech, right? Again, I think this is very much Harris saying, I'm about beating Trump in the future, not about my own accomplishments in the past. But thank goodness, that an immigrant's daughter was the attorney general when she was the attorney general. It's Pete Buttigieg telling the story of just putting dinner on the table, right? We do the same thing every other family does. Don't be threatened by us. It's Warnick, you know, presenting a model of devout faith for everybody to see, right? But coming from a Southern African American man. Please note how much progress has been made when that's the man who represents Georgia, the Deep South, in the Senate, right? So yes, I agree, and thank you for emphasizing that, David. Anybody else? Yeah, Jeanette, go ahead.
I was I thought there were so many wonderful speeches, but the one that impressed me most was Michelle's. And the thing that sort of gave me a new way of thinking about it, and is I think a great way of talking about things, is her thing of affirmative action of generational wealth. And I just think that's a very good way to start thinking about uh, elites and what they can do with it the rest of us can't.
Yeah, excellent. And thank you. And right, Michelle's I want to note her transition as well, right? In the sense of Michelle Obama in 2016 is when they go low, we go high, right? The Democrats were not at all hesitant to go low in 2024, and that includes Michelle Obama, right? The joke about the presidency being a black job was clearly a low dig at Donald Trump. And then you have Barack Obama essentially suggesting that Trump's fixation on crowd size reveals his insecurity about his virility, right? That's going kind of low. But let me add, and I want to emphasize this as well. This was a contest between different visions of where the Democratic Party should go. This was pluralism within the party, but it was also precisely for that reason rich, right? It's hard to know which of these speeches to highlight, which of these speeches to take the most away from, because there was a lot on offer. It was a kind of feast. And having said that, I think part of the reason that the ratings for the DNC were so much higher than the RNC is that there was fresh and rich material on offer in the way that there wasn't at the RNC. I saw Barbara next, Flossie. I do see you, but give me a minute. I'm going to let Barbara go first, okay? Oh, Barbara is David, and David, I've already called on you. Flossie, go ahead. Sorry, bad teacher today. Flossie, you got to unmute.
I think you're talking about how many people were kissing each other and really in love with each other. So that kind of affection just spread. You felt good about people of different faiths joining hands, different colors joining hands. It was a fest of love. It was fun. It was healthy. And
Thank
I
you.
especially love the good Buddha check. That was so touching and so right. But so was the love between Harris and her husband and Obama and his wife. That was a tremendous moment.
Waltz and
Having
his son.
exchange where it was lovely to see them embrace and to see other people embrace. You didn't see that with Trump. All you saw was his bitterness, his sickness, his malice. And thank you for this talk. Really, David, it was lovely.
Thank you, Flossie, as always. And I was going to add Waltz and his son, right? You know, could you see one of Trump's sons tearfully introducing his father, right? Just doesn't seem to be the kind of family. Now, having said all of that, let me point out whether you call it love, whether you call it joy, right? Whether you call it enthusiasm, whether you call it excitement, there was a lot of positive energy in Chicago over these 4 days. I don't think there was a lot of it from Harris. And I think that's important to see, right? That she recognizes to win this election, she can't just have a love fest among the people who are already on her side. She has to reach out to people who voted for Donald Trump and convince them that he is dangerous and she isn't, that he doesn't have policies that address their concerns and needs, and he does. And, I'm sorry, she does, right? And so I do think that one of the things that was striking about Harris in particular is that she didn't simply bask in the celebration. And that's an important contrast between both Trump and Clinton in 2016. Harris has learned the lessons. This is serious business, and I've got to earn your vote and win this race. Gloria, go ahead. Nice to see you. It's been a little while.
I have a comment about the low and the high. I think it was refreshing to see the speakers on the Democratic convention uh, air out the lies that were perpetrated on the American people, whether in action or in words. And I don't know that I would call that a lie, a low. I think it was refreshing to hear that. We felt validated.
Thank you, Gloria. And I'm going to note for a moment that perhaps the most effective propagandistic critique of Adolf Hitler was Charlie Chaplin, just turning him into a comedic spectacle, shrinking him down, depriving him of the stature he claimed for himself, pointing out how risible and laughable so much of this enactment of grandeur was. And that when you poke a hole in the balloon, sometimes you figure out that it's all just hot air, right? And that's one of the things, especially Walz, but Walz and Harris and the Democrats have decided to do with Trump. Let's shrink him back down to the small man that he is and hope that a substantial portion of Americans see him that way. And the best way to do that is probably through humor, right? And I think humor that ridicules self-aggrandizement is not necessarily mean-spirited humor, right? And so yeah, thank you for that, Gloria. But it isn't the kind of sanctimonious, we will just be better than that, which I think doesn't necessarily work against Donald Trump in this political moment with all the social media attention and competition for attention that he generates. All right, everyone. We've gone for almost an hour and a half today. Lovely to be with you. Nice to have good things to discuss. You be well. I will see everyone next week. Take care. Thanks again. Bye bye, guys.